Hello and welcome to our webinar today. If there are any other topics that you would like to see us cover in one of our webinars in upcoming webinars, please contact me. I am Dale Gasparovic, the Student Assistance Center Administrator, and you can contact me at dale.gasparovic@prevention.org. Also, you can follow us on Twitter at SACenterPF for more information, resources, and upcoming events. Or you can email me once again to join our Student Assistance Center group site, which is a site for networking with other SAP professionals and information resources. I am happy to bring a webinar today from Don Mitkus about being trauma informed in the school setting. And I'm going to turn our webinar over to Don here now to begin our presentation. Don, it will be coming your way here in just a second. And it should be coming your way now.
Great. Excellent. Thank you, Dale. As Dale said, my name is Don Mitkus, and I'm a consultant for the Student Assistance Center at Prevention First. And our webinar today is on being trauma-informed in a school setting. Now, this particular topic is getting a lot of buzz and a lot of play on the state level, and it behooves us to get some information about this particular topic, as we may very well be expected to implement some trauma-informed practices in our school setting. So today, what we're going to be covering are three primary objectives. We're going to review some key ideas about early brain development and how trauma impacts that. So we're going to look at how trauma and toxic stress, how that affects young children and adolescents. And then we'll discuss some ideas for preventing and lessening the effect or impact of toxic stress and trauma. So those are the things that we're going to hopefully be able to cover today in this hour. And here we go. So trauma can change the course of a child's life, anyone's life really, but in particular a child's life and their future. Why is this important? Well, in early childhood, trauma and or toxic stress has significant impact on all domains of development: physical, cognitive, emotional, social, and the long-term impact can persist into adulthood and lead to physical and mental health problems, which in turn impact economic and social well-being. So some important terms that we're going to discuss in this presentation is it's a good idea to define these terms. Trauma is an intense event that threatens the safety or security of an individual. Toxic stress is a reoccurring negative experience that threatens safety or security. And traumatic stress is exposure to a terrifying event or ordeal in which severe physical harm occurred or was threatened. And there's a difference between, when we talk about, just to dig a little deeper into this, toxic stress is it's a chronic exposure to very stressful experiences. We all at times experience acute stress. There's times when really something as simple as driving on the expressway and having someone cut us off and slamming on the brakes and nearly getting in an accident is an episode of acute stress. Not necessarily toxic stress, not necessarily traumatic, but causes our body and our brain to activate certain systems because of the possible threat to safety or security. So both can be impactful, but in particular, we'll be talking about toxic stress, which is more chronic and reoccurring. So here we're going to talk about some key concepts of early brain development. The first three months of life are sometimes referred to as the fourth trimester. It's a period of rapid growth of the body and the brain. And the first 5 years are really the most critical for development of skills necessary for success, or a predictor of success for as an adult. There's an old saying, everything I learned, everything I know I learned in kindergarten. However, it's really everything I know I learned in early childhood is a more appropriate saying in this case. So the key concepts we're going to cover in this area are that experience shapes brain architecture, or how the brain is structured. Brains are built from the bottom up. We're going to cover serve and return, and I'll explain what that means. We're going to cover cognitive, emotional, and the fact that cognitive, emotional, and social development are connected. And experience alters how genes are expressed. Neuroscientists and geneticists, they've learned a great deal about the ways human beings develop and the interaction between biology and genetics, environment, and experience. And the science really does reinforce the importance of early childhood as a critical point in development. And it also, science also emphasizes the complex and interconnected nature of development. Is it nature or nurture? It goes back to that old debate, and the reality is it's a complex interaction of the two. So experience is shaping brain architecture. So this is a slide, a slice, if you will, of and close up of neurons in the brain, or a cluster of neurons. So the brain architecture refers to the connection between neurons. At birth, even starting in the third trimester through birth, in the first few months, there's a enormous explosion of growth of neurons and neural pathways. It's just making connections all over the place. It's very, in a way, very indiscriminate. The process of producing and then begins before birth, continues into adulthood. During the first few years of life, about 700 new synaptic connections are formed every second. The connections route information from experience and the environment to the neurons and then to the body for a reaction or an action. So as we go through just the enormity of experiences as an infant and a toddler, we're having all sorts of new and unusual experiences, which result in all sorts of new and amazing pathways being formed in the brain, because we really are just new to this environment as a being. So the more a connection is used, the stronger it becomes. And over time, less or unused connections are pruned, they're trimmed back. This starts to happen in middle childhood, where everything seems possible when you're a kid. As we grow and as we get older, as we go through adolescence and the pruning continues, we see that our paths start to become more defined, because we figure out what we like, what we don't like. We figure out what we're good at, what we're not good at. And those things that we're not good at, those, if there's some connections that have been formed over time, those will get pruned away. Whereas the things that we like to do, those connections will become stronger. Pruning actually helps the brain work more efficiently over time. So you're creating stronger and more efficient neural connections as the pruning process occurs. So in a sense, if you use it, it gets stronger. If you don't use it, you lose it through the pruning process. So, and experience directly affects how, which connections are stronger, which connections are pruned away. So brains are built from the bottom up. What that means is that each new skill is built on previous skills or competencies. There's an old saying, you got to learn how to walk before you run, and you got to learn how to crawl before you can walk. You got to learn how to roll before you can crawl. So there's, something as simple as that we take for granted. Walking is a significant skill development that takes months and months to be able to have those strong enough neural connections that affect how we develop the coordination of muscles and to be able to engage in that act, balance everything, all those things that need to happen. Those neural pathways need to be formed before we can do those things, and those are built on previously gained skills. So the timing of proliferation and pruning is genetically determined. So there are certain things that's why people don't learn how to walk all at the same time. It's just that we, as individuals, have different different programming, so to speak, of when our genes start to fire off as far as the proliferation of neurons and neural connections, and when the pruning begins. So experience affects the strength or the weakness of the neural connections. So another example is one of the first things to develop are sensory pathways, vision and hearing. Then they're followed by pathways associated with language. And once you have language acquisition, higher cognitive competencies, things like abstract thought and thinking that develops in adolescence, can't occur without more complex language acquisition. So again, things that are more complex skills are built upon previously developed foundational skills. Serve and return interactions. So this is where young children will seek out interactions with adults, with others, with somewhat with peers, but more so with adults or older siblings. And the baby babbles and we babble back and baby talk to them. So this is something that helps strengthen neural connections. So this is where we are modeling for our children at this young age. The concept refers to a relationship essentially between a child and their caregivers. So like I said, it could be an older sibling, but more likely as a parent or grandparents or other caregiver. Where the issue can come in development is if they seek a response and it doesn't happen, or the response is intermittent, meaning it doesn't occur with regularity, or it's inappropriate, the connections don't develop or develop in a weaker way. So if for most an infant crying would result in efforts of comfort. If crying results in no response, if crying results in verbal aggression or physical aggression, then there's going to be that seeking, that comfort seeking behavior will weaken, will not only or could be extinguished in more abusive sort of responses to that seeking out behavior. Cognitive, emotional, and social development are all connected. The brain does operate in a very richly coordinated fashion. So emotional well-being, social competence, and cognitive abilities all impact each other. To give you an example, fear, which is an emotion, can diminish interaction, social aspect of social development, and which in turn can diminish opportunities for learning. So a child that is fearful is less likely to engage with others socially, and those that are less engaged socially lose the opportunity for engaging in interactions that could help reinforce a neural connection. Conversely, feelings of happiness or security is more likely to result in increased social interactions, which will then increase opportunities for learning. So the three are interconnected, can't be looked at separately. All right, so don't let this slide don't worry about the specifics of here, but the concept here is that experience alters genetic expression. So we used to think that we couldn't alter genetics, but now we know that our early experiences or experiences in general can alter the way that the genetic program is read. The genes don't change. Our genetic makeup is what it is, but experiences can change whether or not a particular gene is activated. So clinical markers, they attach to the structures in the cell that determine which genes are made available for use. The markers are produced as generated or produced as a result of our environment and experiences. So to give you an example, there was some research done that showed that mice parents who were nurturing to young, the young had certain chemical markers, and those young mice grew to tolerate stress as adults. When the chemical markers were blocked, they artificially by the researchers, they did not tolerate stress as adults, even though they had nurturing parents. So our experiences trigger basically chemical signals to activate certain genes in our DNA. So even though experience can't change our genetics, what experience does is turns on or turns off genes. All right, so here's a little slide to kind of explain the dance between nature and nurture. So development results from an ongoing and cumulative dance between nature and nurture. As we said, it used to be a debate of is it nature or is it nurture, and the conclusion that we've come to is that it's a very complex interaction between the two. And as we talked about, experience influences both genetic expression and brain architecture. So brain development leads to behavioral response, which influences the type of experiences we have. So if we have had nurturing and caring parents and caregivers, we are more likely to have adaptive or healthy behaviors versus maladaptive or unhealthy behaviors. So when we, for a young child that is triggered to stress or anger, then if they have adaptive coping skills, if somebody pushes them on the playground, let's say. For someone that has had a healthy upbringing and is adaptive, they may respond with a, hey, please don't push me, versus someone who had neglected or been exposed to abuse or trauma or toxic stress. They may respond to a push as threatening and may push back in a way that's over the top or overly aggressive. So repetitive, highly stressful experiences damage our brains and can lead, as I said in that example, it can lead to an overactive adverse response system. So, again, for those that have positive experiences, it activates the genetic potential for countering adversity. So in summary, in regards to early brain development, it's most intense before age 5. By the time we hit age 5, we're pretty much, the bread is cooked about 95% of the way. So where, our personality disposition, outlook, our ability to trust or engage those things are pretty hardwired by the time we hit age 5. So even before they hit school, um, their majority of the brain development has occurred, and they develop in response to experience. And brain development directly impacts cognitive, social, and emotional skills, which lead to adult behaviors and competencies. So that's how our brain development is impacted at a very early age can very well determine how we are able to cope and engage socially and able to cognate effectively as an adult. Key point here is that the those that have experienced trauma or toxic stress that impact their brain development at an early age, this happens before we ever see them in a school setting.
Hey, Don.
So, yes, Dale.
A quick question. You mentioned the overactive response due to that traumatic exposure. And I'm
Mm-hmm.
also wondering if we also might see a different predictive kind of response. So those who are impacted by that traumatic stress or traumatic events are more predictive of negative consequences.
And that certainly, we're going to talk about that in a second. Those that experience, those that have what's referred to and what we'll be talking about as adverse childhood experiences, are more likely to have maladaptive coping responses to stress, just in general. And the types of maladaptive coping strategies are, we'll cover those as well, but there's quite a list of them. But these are all, the point being is when we see these behavior, these maladaptive coping skills, it behooves us to kind of explore a little bit and have an understanding that this might be coming from a particular event. It's a clue. Unfortunately, we tend to look at kids that are acting out or engaging in maladaptive behaviors as that there's something wrong with them, and that's they're expressing something that happened to them at could be a very early age and may not have even a cognitive understanding of why they're reacting in a particular way. Particularly if they experience the trauma when they're pre-verbal. So does that answer your question, Dale?
Yes, sir.
Okay. So objective 2, talking about stress and trauma and toxic stress. So essentially, stress is normal. If you rated your stress on a scale from 1 to 10, if you're at 1, you'd be asleep. So at any given time of the day, we are under stress. Stress. It actually does help us to learn. Where stress can make us more focused. There's a physiologic response that occurs when we experience stress, including increased heart rate and respiratory rate, increased blood pressure, increased levels of stress hormones like cortisol and norepinephrine. And stress can also, more intense levels of stress can trigger certain very basic survival responses that have been genetically programmed into us from the time when we were running away from saber-toothed tigers or large animals and didn't have walls or cities to defend ourselves. In order to survive, we had to learn how to react quickly to danger and stress, or stressful danger. So that's in a sense, we're talking about the fight or flight response, fight, flight, or freeze. It allows us to, with the physiological reactions that occur, the increased heart rates, the increased respirations, which provide more oxygen, sharpens our focus and our awareness, of our surroundings and readies the body to act, to do something in the fight or flight response. So when that's activated, our frontal lobe, our executive functioning, isn't as engaged as our more basic animal part of our brain that is saying you're either gonna meet this threat head on and fight it, or you're gonna run away from it, or you're gonna freeze so it doesn't notice you. But what it really comes down to is that we all experience stress, and not all stress is potentially traumatic. Not all stress is bad. Stress allows us to act, to do things, to protect ourselves, to accomplish tasks, to finish things, whether it's at school or at work or in our relationships. If there's stress, it means that if you're experiencing stress about something, it means there's something in your environment that you think is not right and needs attention. So stress helps us focus on the things that we need to take care of on a day-to-day, hour-to-hour, minute-by-minute basis. But we all have individual abilities with how we and competencies on how we deal with stress or particular types of stress. What stresses me out or causes me stress is different than what causes Dale stress, which is different than causes you stress. You can have the same exact event occur for 10 different people, and they respond to it in 10 different ways. And a lot of that is predicated on our genetic propensity to be able to deal with stress or stressful events, and our early childhood brain development and our experiences before the age of 5 that dictate how well or how able we are to deal with stress or stressful events. So there are 3 types of stress. We kind of alluded to this. There's positive stress, which creates a brief increase in heart rates, mild elevations in stress hormone levels. There's tolerable stress, which is serious, but it's a temporary response, and it can be buffered by supportive relationships. And again, in that example of being in a car and being cut off and nearly getting in an accident, but just narrowly avoiding it, it could be a tolerable level of stress, or it can be a toxic level of stress, depending on how you react. And you could have your significant other or child in the car and say, wow, that's, we made it out of that. Wow, that's great. Thanks for not getting us in an accident. You handled that really well. And having that kind of support and nurturing can trigger a calming down or a reduction in the stress that you're experiencing in that moment, versus having some maladaptive coping skills to stress, where you might be swearing, throwing things, yelling at the person through the window, even though it's not possible that they can hear you, up to road rage and chasing the person down and getting out of the car and banging on the windows. So it's how you can adapt and how you can engage in supports to handle stress can mean the difference between something being positive, tolerable, or toxic. Okay. Then, how does trauma, which is, again, in talking about trauma, is an experience that overwhelms the ability to cope. Young children experience trauma differently than older children or adults do. It's primarily a sensory experience. There's really 3. There's mainly the differences that make a child more vulnerable is that the brain is still developing, and that trauma is more likely to change or damage the brain architecture. So children aren't able to anticipate danger and protect themselves as an older child or an adult can, because their experience is more limited, and they have a more limited ability to express their thoughts and feelings. So for an older child or an adult that experiences a traumatic event, because their language acquisition is much farther along, they're better able to put words to their feelings, words to their reaction, which can help them process it. Whereas a younger child, or again, especially a pre-verbal child, doesn't have that ability, and is more likely to internalize that trauma in a way that's more connected to a sensory experience than it is that they're able to verbally express. So they also have a different understanding of the causation. So they're more likely to internalize that what has happened to them is because of something that they did. And developmentally, it's because children under the age of 5 are very self-centric. They believe that they have, their actions are what cause things to happen all around them, whether or not they do. So it's just from the brain development and the personality development standpoint, they're very self-centered. So they are more likely to internalize a traumatic event as something that they caused, or that because of their thoughts or because of their wishes or because of their fears, this traumatic event occurred to them. So one of the effects, this is a slide of I think it's a functional MRI of brain functioning. Someone who's the slides, they show the structure of the neurons in the hippocampus and prefrontal cortex. These are areas that are important for learning and behavior. The neuron on the right, which has been subjected to chronic stress, shows underdeveloped neural connections or weaker brain architecture. You can see the slide on the left, the neural connections and pathways are much more robust. So what you're seeing is really the direct impact of toxic stress. And this is, again, toxic stress versus trauma. Toxic stress is chronic and reoccurring negative experiences. So a child that is routinely not getting their basic daily needs met, that is being routinely subjected to violence in their community, that is routinely the victim of verbal or emotional or physical abuse, which can be traumatic events, but it's that they're living with a chronic toxic level of stress, which again, this impacts directly on their brain structure. So what are the long-term consequences? There was a study that was conducted called the Adverse Childhood Experiences Study. Now, an ACE score, which is basically kind of tallying up the adverse child experience. There's a whole list of them, experiences that a child is exposed to. As that score goes up, they are more likely, so that their chances of these are increased as well. So high-risk behaviors, such as smoking or substance use, behavioral health problems, such as depression, suicidal ideation, non-suicidal self-injury, domestic violence with an intimate partner. Also physical health problems, STDs, COPD, liver disease, ischemic heart disease, and early death. So the study, which had about 17,000 participants, which is a huge number, mostly Caucasian, average age was about 57, mostly middle class, not exactly a high-risk population. Well, this was done through Kaiser Permanente in California, which is the health system that is pretty much owns California. They had their primary care physician network ask participants ask questions about 10 adverse childhood events, such as physical or sexual abuse, neglect, separation from a parent, living with a person that's suffering from a mental illness or a chemical dependency issue. And the ACE score is the number of adverse events that occurred before the age of 18. So they came up with this graphic, this pyramid, to kind of explain how these issues build upon each other. So from conception to death, and when you experience a larger number of adverse childhood experiences, the key number here is 4. 4 or more adverse childhood experiences before the age of 18 will disrupt neural development, as we talked about, will change brain architecture, which in turn will result in social, emotional, and cognitive impairments. And from those impairments, they are an individual is more likely to adopt behaviors that put them at a health risk. And adoption of these risky behaviors results in disease, disability, or social/legal problems. And those diseases and disabilities and social/legal problems typically are indicative of someone who's not going to live out an average lifespan and result in early death. So we can see that even things that happen before the age of 5 can have a tremendous impact on how someone's lifespan is impacted and the quality of life during that span. So, summary: trauma, the impact of trauma and toxic stress, it changes physiology, it changes brain architecture, it changes skills, abilities, and behaviors, and it changes health and mental health. So what's the good news? Despite all of this, and those that do experience toxic stress, do experience traumatic events, or develop traumatic stress, despite this, things aren't hopeless. We do have the ability to impact this progression at any point with good intervention, good identification, and good intervention. And the earlier, as you can see, the pyramid, things build upon each other. The earlier we act, the earlier we identify, and the earlier we're able to intervene and do something, the better the outcome for that individual. So early childhood trauma or traumatic events or toxic stress is not it's not a death sentence. That ship's course can be altered. The key concept here for altering this course is that supportive relationships buffer and protect young children from the effects of toxic stress and trauma. Nurturing interactions builds healthy brain architecture that is then the foundation of health and well-being. So the early childhood education arena, it does get this. And we as the folks that are interacting with kids in a school setting have the opportunity to provide them with a supportive, nurturing relationship, appropriate, supportive and nurturing relationship. We're not parents, but the act of being a support and a nurturer of our students is something that can mitigate the impact of some of this toxic stress or trauma that they're experiencing. So what's important for us as folks that are dealing with kids on the front line is that it's important for us to understand the impact of trauma for adults and kids, and that we're able to have a process where we screen for these things, and that we can teach strategies for preventing and mitigating stress and trauma, and that we are connected enough with our community that we can connect an individual with resources to help them address the trauma in a more clinical setting. So it's, parents, caregivers, early childhood providers, these are folks that are in a great position to influence outcomes for these children. some of the components for trauma-informed care and prevention include screening. So when you're talking with or intervening with a kid that perhaps is having a behavioral issue, when you ask what's wrong, the implication there is that there's something wrong with their behavior, which in turn is something wrong with them. Asking what happened rather than what's wrong is more likely to solicit a helpful response. Something to be aware of is that we're seeing second, third, fourth generation kids that have a long familial history of unresolved trauma. That we're seeing third generation eating disorder. We're seeing second generation kids engaging in non-suicidal self-injury. So if you're seeing a kid that's expressing maladaptive coping skills, like many things, we learn how to deal with stress and how to cope with things from our primary teachers, which are our parents. So if we have a parent that's suffering from unresolved trauma issues, they're modeling these behaviors for their kids. So just be aware that if you're dealing with a kid that's expressing these maladaptive coping skills, and you're going to call the parent, just be aware that you might be dealing with someone that also has unresolved trauma issues. So in this case, it's an opportunity to educate. We're not there to fix the parents. We're not there. It's not our role to intervene with parents or say, "Hey, do you have unresolved trauma? Maybe you should get some help." But rather to talk about what's effective for, what kind of help is available for their kids, and getting them connected with an appropriate professional that can then, because that's more their role, to say, "Hey, let's dig into the family history and find out what's going on. Oh, you had this experience too. Let's help you address it so you don't continue to pass this along to your child."
Don, I want to give a kind of a lesser, kind of lower level example of that. If you look back at September 11th and how it impacted people across the country ultimately, that sometimes can get passed along to children as well. I noticed it even in my own child who was born that year, that September 11th happened, and even she experienced some level of stress as a result of our experience of that kind of traumatic event.
Oh, absolutely. Because with any traumatic events, when you run into something that reminds you of it, and usually it's a sensory experience, so it could be, it could be the anniversary, it could be, explosion of firecrackers or something on 4th of July that can remind you of that event. We have a response to it, and our children watch us very closely on how we respond to things, and they try it out. And that can, they develop a neural pathway when they do that. So if we are responding in a particular way to something that had happened previously, even if they don't have direct experience of it, it can impact how they react to that as well. So it's, one of the things that we, need to be careful of is, especially in our positions, is we don't want to, as we're exploring these things, we don't want to traumatize or trigger toxic stress in the individual. We have to be careful on how we do these sorts of screenings. We certainly, and here's where, I want to provide a point of caution. Trauma is talked about a lot. It's very buzzy right now. There's a lot of discussion of it at the state level and implementing trauma-informed care in schools and such. And there's a certain portion of the population that believes that everyone has experienced trauma. Um, and everyone has traumatic experiences that they have to that impact how they're dealing with things. And the reality is that's just not the case. Um, if everyone has had trauma, then it lessens those that have actually experienced serious trauma. It lessens the impact for them of what it means to process a traumatic event. So we need to be careful that we're not labeling everything trauma. It's, I got yelled at by my parents because I wouldn't put my dishes away, is not trauma. It might be stressful, but it's not traumatic. Um, I was there. We have to be cautious on what we choose to discuss as trauma. So, and we also need to be careful on how we address it when we're dealing with an individual. We're not necessarily going to say, "Hey, what kind of have you had a traumatic experience?" What we may rather do is emphasize what children need, teach coping skills, enhance protective factors, accentuate those factors that are more likely to mitigate the long-term effects of whatever trauma or toxic stress that they're experiencing, rather than focusing on what was the traumatic event, what happened to you. That only re-traumatizes the individual. Trauma work is, if someone has indeed experienced trauma, you got to be really cautious on how you unpack that as a therapeutic professional, not as a school professional. There's to be quite honest, there's really no place in a school setting where you should be doing trauma work with an individual. It's very complex, and it's very easy to re-traumatize an individual if you're not well trained and cautious in how you approach it, especially if they're in a process of routinely engaging in a maladaptive coping skill. So for those that are abusing a substance, those that are engaging in repeated aggressive behaviors because they can't self-regulate, those that are engaging in non-suicidal self-injury or have a serious depression, depressive episode. These are folks that aren't ready to start unpacking their trauma. They need stabilization of these behaviors first. They need coping skills. They need to learn how to deal with these strong feelings and emotions that they're not able to deal with because of these early childhood experiences that impact their ability to cope. So they find other ways to cope that are not healthy or not adaptive. So until you can teach them how to cope with these strong feelings, until they're at that point, they really can't dig into the core trauma or toxic stress issues. To do so is too early, is irresponsible and potentially harmful. So what we know what young children need, and they crave. They crave safety. They crave security. They crave nurturing. Safe environments reduce the likelihood that trauma will occur, or re-traumatization. We can't control whether or not they've experienced trauma. What we can control, what we can do, is make sure that the environment that we have control over is safe for them, that they will not be re-traumatized in the environments that we have control over. Security means stability. Children develop best when there's consistency in their environment and their relationships. That includes good rules and limits and guidance on what's appropriate and what's not. They need something to model. And in a safe and secure environment, if they're modeled good coping skills and healthy coping skills, they're more likely to pick up on those and try them out, which hopefully will help mitigate downstream adverse consequences. Nurturing consists of support, reassurance, and encouragement. They're responsive to the needs of the child. So that means being aware that if you've got a child that has experienced some sort of trauma, that they may act out in different ways that they're not trying to necessarily disrupt the classroom or the school environment, but what they're trying to get their needs met in a maladaptive way, and they need to be redirected in a supported way. I know you're feeling. I know this is a really strong feeling right now. Let's sit with it. Let's figure out a different way to do with it. Let's draw. Let's color. Let's journal. Do something that is more adaptive as far as coping with that particular strong emotion or response. So we need to encourage development of social emotional skills. We need to help them in their formation of relationships, which can be impacted by how they've learned how to engage in relationships in a stressful, toxic stress or traumatic environment. So we may need to redirect them or help guide them on what is appropriate in a relationship with a peer. And we can best model that in how we form relationships with them and express relationships with them. We need to encourage them to communicate what their needs are verbally and appropriately versus non-verbally or inappropriately. We need to help them learn how to regulate their emotions, be mindful of where their stress level, anger levels are at. Be mindful of if they're having an impulse to act out in a particular way, to be able to take a step back. We need to help them develop, to explore their world in a safe, nurturing way. So it's these social emotional skills provide the foundation for coping with adversity. If they can do these things, they will create opportunities to get the support that they need. And then with the caregivers, and again, keep in mind that the caregivers could very well have been have experienced trauma or toxic stress themselves. What we can do is give them some tools to work with as well. We can talk about the important, without actually saying, "Hey, were you traumatized?" We can say, "These are some things that gosh, your kid's having a tough time. Make sure that you are attending to these things as a caregiver. That you're that you're engaging in self-care, that you're getting enough to eat, getting enough sleep, exercising, that you're utilizing appropriate stress management skills or coping skills. Do you have support? Do you have things to do that you can relieve stress? Do you exercise? Do you have a hobby? If you don't have these things, these are some things that would be helpful for you to develop. And help them with their own problem-solving skills. It's like, hey, here's some resources on access to health care, or if you're having these are some financial supports through the county or the health department that can help you out if you're having stressors of your own that's making it less likely for you to deal with the stresses your child is experiencing. So when their needs is essentially, so when they're able to better cope with their own stressors, they're going to be in a better position to be that supportive, nurturing caregiver that their child needs them to be, that all children need their caregivers to be. So another thing that we can do is enhance protective factors. We can do parent universities where we talk about resiliency, about social support. We can educate parents on child development and parenting skills, Roots and Wings programs, things that are that can help them be the type of support that would mitigate later issues for their children. Research shows that when these factors, nurturing attachment, again, concrete support, social support, knowledge of parenting, when they're established, the likelihood of abuse or neglect decreases. Family strengthens and family strengthens a family environment that will promote healthy child development. These actions can be simple, but emphasizing small but significant changes in everyday activities can make a real difference for that child. And when education isn't enough, when the issues are more complex, the behaviors are more severe. Referral for services is for the child or the family is crucial, and having a connection, having established relationships with these resources in your community is really vital prior to you needing them. So it behooves us to form those relationships before there is a need, so we know where the resources are, how we can connect the families to them, and in a way that we're not just saying, hey, call this place, and they call it, and the service is no longer available, or they have to wait 6 months for it. There's just a number of things that can go wrong when you're trying to make a referral, but you're not aware of what those resources can provide at that time. So, some of the things you can refer to for family member, for parents or caregivers, job training, school completion for the child or the family, mental health treatment, substance abuse treatment, domestic violence services. These are all things that are in most, if not all, communities. Sometimes the resources are robust. I'm in the DuPage County outside of Chicago, and we have an embarrassment of treatment riches. And even with that, we have organizations, we have NAMI, we have treatment providers, we have social service agencies that are still operational. So we have a number of resources. Even with that, it can be a struggle to get someone connected in a timely fashion, especially if they need something like psychiatric services or a medication evaluation, and they're on, and they have no insurance or are underinsured or have Medicaid. It can be not weeks but months before they can see that sort of provider. So it's if you have a relationship with these folks and these agencies, the chances of them getting attended to in a more timely manner are greater, because you know who to call, you know who to connect them with, and you can educate them on the process on how to get that help. So in summary, in general, trauma and toxic stress change a child's experience of the world. This leads to changes in biology and brain architecture, and as a result, they will act differently. There's if you look at Erickson's theory of child development, the first learning task that we have is learning trust versus mistrust. That's the very first, as an infant, that's the very first thing we learn is, can we trust our environment to react to us and meet our needs? From that first cry when you're hungry or need a change, and there's someone there that responds. That's learning that your needs will be attended to is crucial and happens very, very early. And when those needs aren't met, and you learn to mistrust your environment at a very early age, that can carry through a lifetime. And children can act very defensively or self-protectedly. This how the changes and how they act impacts how they can learn, how they get along with others, how they take care of themselves. And the key takeaway for us as folks that are working with kids on the front line is that supportive relationships can be protective, and can help mitigate the impact of trauma and toxic stress. So don't undervalue or be dismissive of the importance of our relationships with our students and the children that we work with. They can have significant impact that we may never see directly, but can have a long-term impact on their ability to cope and interact in the world. And that is the presentation. I've listed my email here. If you do have questions, do feel free to reach out and contact me. Happy to answer any questions you might have in regards to this subject. I look forward to our next webinar, and we have a few more in the series. this semester. So thank you for your attention, and have a good day.
Thank you, Don. I want to second that. If you would and have any questions, please contact Don at his email address, or you can contact me. Again, my email address is dale.gasparovic@prevention.org. We appreciate your time today in viewing this webinar. Thank you.